my full government name is Cheeseworth Ronald Reginald John Josh Steve Alucard McDude. My parents were very indecisive, and I'm a real big characters guy. One thing that most people learn very quickly about me is that I absolutely love storytelling. This love of storytelling translates directly into a love of telling stories for me, and that translates into a love for my characters. Or, as I call them, my fake people that I made up in my head that have been persistently haunting me ever since I was in 7th grade. I'm a little bit obsessed with them. And when I say obsessed, I do mean obsessed. Obsessed wholly and entirely with this specific set of characters. Ask anybody who knows me in real life, they will tell you that I never shut up about them. I am insufferable. I tried to make a webcomic about them once, but my body rebelled against me, which caused me to have a moment of deep personal reflection, for lack of anything else to do, during which I realized that I make a better writer than I do an artist, and also that I wanted to fix my world building. In fact, fixing my world building and talking about my creative process is like the main purpose of this channel. I'm currently working on a full overhaul of my fantasy setting, or at least the main country of my fantasy setting as we speak, but that video is still cooking and it's probably gonna take a little while to cook, and I figured that I could probably get this video out pretty quick while that one's still in the oven. I have about 6 main characters in this story that all of these characters are from, and I'm planning on giving each of them their own introductory videos to go in between my more difficult videos, in which I will go over and reflect on the history of their development, as well as introduce the current versions of the characters and some fun facts about them. I'll introduce the characters' current versions as well as I can, anyway. I'm planning on actually releasing this story for public consumption, hopefully sometime this decade. We'll see, but I don't want to spoil everything about my current plans, you know? This particular video is about my favorite homeless vagrant with an impossibly convoluted backstory, Leone Vallem. So, when I first made this character, I was in middle school, and spoilers for how young I am, but that was in 2020, back when The Owl House and Amphibia were both actively airing, and I was really into those kinds of shows. You know, cartoons that are allegedly targeted towards children ages 6 to 11, but have fan bases filled with neurodivergent people ages 12 to 25. Shows like Steven Universe, Gravity Falls, Adventure Time, etc., etc., I've talked about it before. Anyway, the point is, I wanted to make my own show like that. I wanted to create my own show like that. Those types of cartoons were my only real exposure to complex storytelling that covered serious topics in animation, since the only anime I had seen at the time were Pokemon X and Y and Indigo League, and I didn't really read any books at this age. This character, Leone, was going to be the main character of my show. I wasn't a super big fan of the whole bubbly cartoon protagonist archetype, like Luce from The Owl House, Star from Star Versus, or Steven from Steven Universe. It's not that there's anything wrong with those characters necessarily, I just didn't really care for them when I was at that age in my life. I feel the same way about the typical shonen protagonist archetype now. Even in the earliest drafts of her character, Leone would have been sarcastic, clever, and kind of an agent of chaos. Though, admittedly, I did just kind of describe the other genre of cartoon protagonist at the time, so I wasn't really bucking the trends that hard. I put a lot of my own sense of humor and way of thinking into her, as well as my own attitudes about authority. She was basically just me at the time, but if I'd been more street smart and had more of a backbone. In order to say anything else about her, I have to describe what the show was going to be about. Basically, the premise was that, hidden in the Bermuda Triangle, there was a secret country that was full of magic, and all of the people who lived there were wizards. This country was generally very isolated from the rest of the world, and all of the wizards who lived there were total snobs towards everyone else for not being magic enough. Like, I believe they literally considered themselves to be a different species of human from the rest of the world that was intellectually superior. It was that bad. I literally named the country Insula Snob, which was the result of me plugging the words island and snob into Google Translate for Latin and then mashing them together. It did not occur to me at the time that snob did not have a direct Latin translation because I was not very smart or very knowledgeable at the age of 12. Anyway, all of the non-Leone characters in this story were foreign exchange students from this magical country who were traveling around the world for academic enrichment. These characters included Celadon, an extremely anxious boy who was the child of very important people back on Insula Snob, a much earlier version of a character I now call Marigold, a charismatic and outgoing boy who was bullied for not having glowing eyes, and This girl, who was barely a character at all, to be honest. Her personality would waffle between hyperactive ray of sunshine and wet blanket who only cared about her GPA based on my mood that week. I think I changed her name like 8 or 9 different times. She barely counts. There was also the group's chaperone, Indigo, an exhausted researcher who barely paid any attention to the kids at all. Leone was from the normal, real world, like the rest of us, and would discover the magic kids somehow and then run away to tag along on their journey with them. I promptly realized that, her parents might have a problem with that, so I chopped them out of the picture by making her an orphan. But then I realized that she would still have to have some kind of caregiver. Like, she would either have been adopted, been put into an institution of some kind, or been put into the foster care system. I went with the latter because it seemed the easiest to me at the time. As a foster child, Leone was lonely, had issues with attachment and processing her emotions, and extremely restless as a result of not having any parents or much stability in her life. She felt uncomfortable whenever she stayed in one place for too long and started to get bored and just generally antsy. Should I have been dealing with this topic as a middle schooler who had never been in the foster care system in my life and didn't have any friends who had been in the system? Probably not. But it's fine because none of this ever saw the light of day anyway. Every few episodes, the kids would go to a new country. Most of the episodes would probably consist of Leone causing a problem, somehow out of boredom, impulsiveness, or sheer propensity for chaos, and would often end up fixing said problem, depending on the nature of it, with her own wits. What role did the other characters play in the story, you ask? Well, Celadon mostly just existed to be nervous about everything and angst about his dead abusive dad, and Marigold was a vessel for me to give the worst social commentary ever. I had a lot of trouble trying to come up with things for them to do in all of these countries because at the time I had genuinely never been east of Oklahoma or north of Washington, and I was also a very antisocial, shut-in middle schooler with very few life experiences outside of things I had done with my parents. This story was largely born of wish fulfillment for me as a lonely, isolated preteen who wanted to do cool things but didn't have the requisite friends or street smarts or confidence. In terms of Leone's design, I gave her this big bomber jacket that was supposed to have belonged to her super totally for sure dead and not alive dad. I figured she would put a new patch in it for every country they visited. It was supposed to convey both her character growth and how, under her performative, I don't care about anything and that makes me cool attitude, she was actually super sentimental. She's always been kind of tall and lanky, too. This is partially because I kind of gravitate towards drawing tall and lanky people, but also because I feel like it kind of adds to her expressiveness and her lonely, fish-out-of-water feeling. I think in this earlier draft, she's supposed to be about 5'7" or 5'8" at 12 years old, which is pretty tall for that age, but stay tuned because she only gets taller. I gave her this bob because it was kind of the feminine hairstyle that I defaulted to in all of my drawings, probably because I had a bob exactly like this for at least half of my childhood. I kept it later because I felt like it gave her a properly obnoxious and ratty feeling that communicates her personality as a loud orphan girl who is kind of awkward and doesn't care much about appearances. At the time when I designed her, all of my characters were super pale. I actually only ended up giving her this sort of tannish, light brown skin tone originally because I used the wrong colored pencil on her skin, but then decided that I would just make her ambiguously tan since all of my other characters were pale, and I decided I needed some diversity. Stay tuned for when I give her an actual ethnicity later. Later in this version of the story, I planned on having her go home to Insula Snob with the other characters and learning magic. The story would end with her having a romance with Celadon and with Insula Snob uniting with the rest of the world. I toyed with the idea of her parents still being alive and living on Insula Snob while working as politicians, but never got far enough in the story to get to that plot twist. It probably wouldn't have been a very good twist anyway, considering that I didn't have any plans whatsoever for how this would affect her or progress her arc or contribute to the almost non-existent themes of the story. Seriously, if you had asked me what my themes were, the only things I could possibly have said at that time were monarchy bad and emotions important. I was also like 13 though, so I have no idea why I'm being so critical. Also, to give some credit to me at 13, I did plan on her foster parents not being completely irrelevant to the story and trying to track her down and figure out where she went and getting closure with her eventually. So, at least I sort of kind of tried to think about the consequences of her actions. There's that. I did that. I honestly think the concept for this story had a lot of potential. If I had been a better writer at the time, I definitely could have turned it into something good, but unfortunately I was, again, 13 and I did not have those skills yet. Anyway, on to the next version. This version of the character exists in a completely different version of the story, one that I still have quite a soft spot for, actually. Leone is still a foster child in this version, and I started to go a little bit more in-depth on her psychology and worldview, too. She struggles with the feeling of a lack of agency over her own life and distracts herself by being an instigator, experimenting with other people's tempers to see at what point they would snap and start trying to punch her. She likes to analyze people in this version and enjoys seeing how they react to various stimuli, particularly the stimulus of her annoying the fuck out of them. This works as a way for her to fill her social need without having to develop any genuine attachments to people, as those have always ended in tears for her as someone who has had to move around every year or so. She is, under all of this, very lonely and emotionally bereft. At the beginning of the story, she arrives at her new foster home. This time, her new caretaker has no spouse and no children and lives in a conspicuously large house. Her name is Clementine, and she's an older woman who supposedly works as a lawyer. She has an accent that Leone doesn't recognize and doesn't have any photos of family members or friends anywhere in the house. She's nice enough, though, and pretty good at cooking, so Leone decides it's fine. One day, not long after Leone's arrival, Clementine gets a phone call from somebody called Iris, which results in her and Leone going on a road trip across the entire country from Oregon to Florida to pick up, quote, her great-grandniece and nephew and some other kid apparently. Clementine's great-grandniece and nephew turn out to be Celadon and his sister Fuchsia, who exists now. The apparent some other kid is Marigold, who also exists now. It turns out that Clementine is actually an ex-noble from the magical wizard country of Septent, formerly in Sulasnob, turned secret agent for one of the major politicians of the country, who also happens to be her niece and Celadon and Fuchsia's mom. Celadon and Fuchsia's mom, whose name is Iris, by the way, sent Clementine to go live in the normal, non-magic world and gather information about it because Septent is having an energy crisis where there is too much magical energy, and she thinks that problem could be solved by opening Septent's borders and distributing magic around the world. However, she does want to make sure that Septentrian officials understand the culture of the other countries of the world before establishing diplomatic relations, which is why she sent Clementine there. Iris sent Celadon and Fuchsia to go live with Clementine for the school year because she's getting divorced from their dad and didn't want them to witness the carnage. Marigold came with because he was eavesdropping and threatened to tell the cops if she didn't let him come. I know, this is some kind of insane shit, but bear with me. The existence of Septent is still supposed to be a secret to all non-Septentrians, but Clementine decides it's okay if she tells Leone about it because it would be kind of hard to hide it from her considering she's literally sharing a room with Fuchsia, a notably magical person. This means that Leone gets to be involved in stupid wizard hijinks. Notable plot threads from this version of the story include, none of these kids know how to read in English, so Leone, who does not even know what a semicolon is or does, has to teach them. Fuchsia gets suspended on her first day of school for fighting a guy develops a grudge and starts bullying them. Marigold deals with his inferiority complex in the dumbest ways possible, and Celadon has a panic attack almost every single episode. This version of the story was a lot better in terms of how I balanced the cast. Each of the characters had their own unique skill sets, and each episode would usually focus on a different one. A lot of Leone's episodes would focus on exposition and on her developing relationships with the other characters and slowly getting uncomfortably attached to them. Celadon would have episodes that focused on him gaining more confidence and independence. Marigold would have episodes wherein he would try to one-up the other characters to satisfy his aforementioned inferiority complex, and, well, I never actually wrote any episodes for Fuchsia, but I did at least think about them. They were usually about her having a really codependent relationship with Celadon and, letting him have his own independence and stuff. Her entire character revolved around him, and this was partially because of, them having a very traumatic upbringing and therefore becoming kind of codependent, and it was partially also because I didn't know how to write her outside of her relationship with him. Getting back on track, this version of Leone is, in my opinion, the funniest. She hits that sweet spot of just depressed and irreverent enough to still be funny, without also reminding you, tragically, of your very first existential crisis. She also has the sense of humor of an unhinged middle schooler, which I really appreciate. It's an aspect of her that's definitely waned as I changed the setting of the story to be more high fantasy and can't use modern slang anymore. As far as her design goes, I wouldn't say I really changed that much. I gave her this new outfit specifically with a lot of carrying space in mind to put things in her pockets. I also gave her slightly darker skin and changed her eyes to brown because I was like, humans don't have purple eyes, and she's supposed to be like a pretty normal human, so doesn't make any sense for her to have purple eyes. I also added her freckles in this version, but I think that I forgot that she didn't have freckles in the original version, so I gave all of them freckles in this drawing, but shh, don't tell anybody that. This is also the version in which I became aware of the ambiguously brown trope, and I wanted to not do that trope, so I decided to give her a canon ethnicity. Quick side note about that. I am not saying that I think this trope is always inherently bad, but I do think that in some settings, it really doesn't make sense. Like, in a fantasy setting where racism doesn't exist or the concept of race works entirely differently than it does in reality, I feel like it's a lot more justifiable. God damn it, shut up, computer. Quick side note about that. I'm not saying that I think this trope is inherently always bad, but I do think that in some settings, it just really doesn't make any sense at all. Like, in a high fantasy setting where racism doesn't exist or the concept of race works entirely different than it does in reality, I feel like it's a lot more justifiable to have characters that look a certain way without being tied to a specific racial or ethnic group. I've also heard really good arguments against that, though, so again, like, you know, nuance. In real life, though, especially where racism exists, thus making race a significant factor in everyday life for a lot of people, I don't think that ambiguously brown characters make a lot of sense, which is why I made this decision for this character. Since her name was already Leone, which was spelled with an A at the time, and which I thought was a name of Spanish origin at the time as well, but, I mean, apparently it's not, but I thought it was, I decided to make her Latina. I remember specifically deciding that her parents, who are actually dead in this version, were from Venezuela. I chose Venezuela for her specifically just because I thought that the name of the country sounded cool, and I did little to no research about it besides looking up most common Venezuelan surnames and picking one for her at random. I definitely could have done better, but considering that she doesn't remember her parents and was raised by a series of different people of different ethnicities, she probably isn't very connected to her heritage anyway. Anyway, now it's time for... Okay, so as I very bluntly foreshadowed 2 paragraphs ago, this version of the story is the one in which I switched to a high fantasy setting. I mostly made this decision for fun, but it does have some helpful bonuses. Mostly just that I can have this character be an orphan without anybody worrying too hard about who's taking care of her. Orphans in fantasy settings are a storied tradition that requires very little explanation. My parents died, that's it. No one cares. I could also have given her parents in this version, since she's living at a fantasy boarding school for most of the plot anyway, but I decided against it because this character is honestly a lot more interesting when she has angst about having no parents versus, like, parent-related angst, if that makes any sense. This version of the story takes place in Septent, where Leone was born just like everybody else. Septent is ruled by this thing called the Pentarchy, which is like 5 monarchies for the price of 1. There are 5 royal families, each with 1 king or queen, and that king or queen will have one of 5 very specific governmental roles. There's the king or queen justice, king or queen treasurer, king or queen ambassador, king or queen general, and the king of kings, which is a gender-neutral title. Sort of. Most of the Pentarchy members are super classist and awful and evil for a reason that I didn't justify within the story. The queen ambassador, though, is chill. She's just built different. She notices the extremely annoyingly high petty crime rates in Septent and decides that mandatory free public education is the way to fix it long term. Which, you know, free public education is good, but it doesn't really solve poverty or classism or employment discrimination or the fact that these illiterate adolescents you're sending to school are not being properly accommodated by the pre-existing schools meant for rich people. Also, the way that they choose what school to send these poor kids to is that they just default to the closest school to their permanent address, and if the kid is homeless and doesn't have a permanent address, they just send them to the closest school to the police station they were brought to. Which is how you end up with a bunch of poor and homeless kids who can't read being sent to the most prestigious school in the country, Septon Stella's Academy for Gifted Minds. Septon Stella's Academy for Gifted Minds, or SAGM as I'll be calling it for the rest of this video, is nestled pretty deep in the more affluent areas of Montchevit, Septon's capital city. So naturally, Septon's extremely out-of-touch government didn't expect there to be any poor people there. But there are still going to be, like, children of construction workers or low-class servants who live close to the area and will thus be sent to the school by default. There's also Leone, who was a homeless vagrant and got arrested in the right place at the right time. Now, one might imagine that getting sent to Sagum as a poor person who had previously had very few or no prospects in life might be very lucky. Fortuitous, even, some might say. Especially because Sagum is a very prestigious school that offers a high-quality education. A diploma from there could open up like half the job market and pretty much any university a person wanted to go to in the future. So in those respects, it is pretty good to be sent there. However, while Sagum is a prestigious institution, it is also a prestigious institution. All of the students there are extremely rich, many of them part of the nobility, and the faculty there is basically all the same. Do you really think they want a bunch of grimy poor people sullying the hallowed halls of their school? Trick question, of course they don't. Pretty much everybody there, student or faculty, is either actively hostile towards these new arrivals or entirely apathetic. And most of the kids have been told their whole lives that they're inherently lesser than their rich and noble peers and that they could never hope to succeed in a place like this. They're not super excited to be there either. This version of Leone isn't much different from previous ones in terms of personality, aside from being significantly more depressed and world-weary. In this version of the story, she was raised for about the first 9 years of her life in an orphanage before being kicked out for some reason that I never decided on, and kind of lived as a wanderer and a street urchin after that. She has wind magic, which allows her to travel significantly faster than the average person, so she's pretty mobile. She lives a lifestyle that would make considerably more sense if she were not 13 years old. Like, listen, I can believe that a 13-year-old is traveling around on her own, okay? But not if she's been doing it since she was 9. Like, I can't believe that a 9-year-old is doing that and not dying or getting kidnapped immediately. But regardless of that small discrepancy, she hugely dislikes routine and sameness, especially enforced routine and sameness, and staves off her internal feelings of emptiness by avoiding routine and sameness like the plague. Can't feel the void if I'm constantly having new experiences, except I totally can, eventually, because the adrenaline and serotonin wear off and the only thing left to feel is nothing. You can imagine why she might not react well to being forced to go to a boarding school. She gets off on causing chaos around the school while she waits for the government to kick her out, but her tolerance for bullshit is also, like, way lower in this story because she's mad about being sent to school. Nothing much really changed about her design except that I gave her blue eyes again because pretty much nobody in this fantasy world has a normal eye color since eye colors are influenced by magic and not genetics. Mostly. It's complicated and I don't want to explain it right now. She's also wearing this stupid, boring school uniform. Like, what school has just gray as their uniform color? It looks like a fancier prison uniform, and that wasn't even intentional, I was just lazy. Her planned character arc would consist mostly of her getting over her fear of attachment and sameness by developing new relationships and sticking with them. She would also develop the ability to have hope for the future after being in a place that allows her to prepare for it. I mostly wrote this version of the story for fun, and I wasn't really taking it all that seriously, so I have no idea what I was planning on doing with all of my political commentary that I shoved in there for some reason. The political commentary, plus thinly veiled religious commentary that I didn't mention when summarizing the premise, in general, was not very good, on account of it being in the story only because I had just developed political opinions for the first time when I was writing it. I did get better at developing a cast of characters and giving all of them something to do in this version, though. Pretty much every member of the cast had their own plot thread going on, or multiple if they were lucky. Well, pretty much every member of the cast except for Leone. She kind of just observed other people's plot threads from the background, kind of like Nick from The Great Gatsby if he was a weird teenage girl. This version of her character is a bit of a downgrade in my opinion. She's a lot less active in the story, and she can't be as funny either because there's less material to make jokes out of in a fantasy world where modern pop culture doesn't exist, or at least I felt like there was at the time. Now, the current version of my story is just like this last version I just talked about, but if it wasn't set in a boarding school and didn't suck. Or at least, I hope it doesn't suck. The story is also a lot more character-driven now. Almost every plot point, especially towards the beginning, is the result of a named character making a decision. Probably a stupid decision. Or a debatably stupid decision. Or a stupid decision in like an array of all stupid choices of decisions to make. For example, the inciting incident of the plot is when Celadon, yeah, remember him, he'll probably be the subject of the next video, who is a prince in this story, panics and attempts to flee the country because he doesn't want to be involved in his alive abusive father's crazy political power play. The plot ensues when he's forced to take the scenic route through the deadly murder forest and almost dies repeatedly. Lucky for him, Leone happens to spend her summers in the deadly murder forest, and she saves his entire ass from getting dismembered. Marigold is also there. Hijinks and better political commentary ensue. In this version, Leone is a couple years older. She's around 16 or 17, but she's not sure which because she doesn't remember when her birthday is or even what the date today is. What, you think she carries a calendar on her? Be for real, she doesn't even carry a backpack. She does still live as a wandering vagabond, but I feel like that's more reasonable with her age and abilities than it was in the previous version of the character. For one, she's had a lot more time to acquire survival skills and experience, and for another, she's very physically imposing on account of how tall she is. She's about 6'4" here, and most Septentrians tend to be more on the shorter side, so she's really towering over people. She's got a long, convoluted backstory that involves being raised in fantasy Catholic school, and then joining a gang, and then self-exiling twice. For the last 2 or so years of her life, she's been wandering around in the wilderness during the warmer seasons and then retiring into the cities to work odd jobs and earn a very modest living so that she doesn't freeze to death during the colder ones. She still has this same fear of attachment and sameness as she did in previous drafts of her character, but she's also still a human. She gets lonely, but she doesn't want to get too close to people, so she's morphed into what I like to call a relationship completionist. This means essentially that she likes to be around people and entertain herself with them because she finds them interesting, but she will specifically bar herself from developing any kind of emotional attachment to them. She loves to play with people and see them react to things because she sees them as little more than experiments and objects of her entertainment. This isn't necessarily to say that she doesn't have empathy, but more so that she purposefully nips it in the bud for her own protection. She's a completionist because she will purposefully learn everything she can about a person before cutting them off to minimize pain. Very Byronic of her. Anyway, I should probably shut up about the complex inner workings of her character. This kind of thing is better told through, actual storytelling, but I digress. Aside from this, she's got a very, eclectic vibe. She's got the kind of vocabulary you really wouldn't expect to see from a homeless vagrant who's technically never had a formal education before in her life, and the kind of fast-talking, dramatic diction you'd expect from a particularly charismatic door-to-door salesman. She also speaks with a pretty noticeable New York accent that in-universe comes from her home city of Mabe Port. To be honest, now that I think of it, a lot of aspects of this character are probably the result of me looking at a classic Tumblr sexy man and going, but what if that were a girl? Byronic heroes were also pretty much the original Tumblr sexy man, though, to my understanding, so it all checks out. She's also pretty world-weary, and her train of thought is kind of just like one existential crisis after another. It's gotten to the point where she's pretty much immune to it, though. I obviously made her quite a bit taller than previous versions, but in addition to that, I gave her a tiny bit more muscle. Not a lot, obviously, since she's subsisting on a diet of, squirrels and nuts, and it's hard to build a visually significant amount of muscle when you're that tall anyway, because there's more area to cover, but it's enough to make her look convincingly more physically capable, I hope. I gave her a haircut too, both because I imagine that roughing it in the woods would be hard if you're constantly getting stuff stuck in your hair, and also because she's used to dressing as a guy in this universe. Septent is very patriarchal, so for the sake of not being harassed or assaulted, she passes herself off as a boy, which is usually fairly easy for her on account of her build and height and everything. I gave her this rope around her waist because it adds a little bit of intrigue to her outfit and because it's symbolic. It being cut and frayed represents how she's untethered and lacks any connection to life. The hat was to add to the street urchin vibe. I wanted her to look sort of like a fantasy newsboy. And it also sort of foreshadows her future career, but that's like a different conversation. You may also notice that she has fangs and scales now. This is because she is part dragon. Sort of. Only really to the same extent as, everybody else in this universe is part dragon. She's also a different kind of part dragon from some of my other characters. I would explain how that works here, but it would take, forever, so I'll probably explain that in, my next world-building video or something. Some fun facts about this version of Leone include, she sang in the choir at her church when she was a kid and was surprisingly okay at it, but would change the lyrics to be middle school tier that's what she said jokes for fun. She's really good at cheating at card games and, games in general. Her favorite food is crusted fish, a fish-related dish where the fish is cured so heavily that the salt crusts over it and it is doused in vinegar. It's disgusting. If she had access to the internet, she would probably use it to troll people. And she enjoys the smell of flowers. So anyway, This has been the introduction to and history of my favorite girl that everyone keeps accusing of having yaoi hands. Thank you very much for watching this whole video, and if you enjoyed my rambling and or my art, then you could subscribe or something if you want to. I don't care that much. I care a little bit, but not that much. I do care. I'll try to have my next video out, like, hopefully sometime next month. We'll see how busy I am and how hard it is for me to make that video. Anyway, see you later, alligator, except I really hope that none of my viewers are alligators because it would be kind of scary. I think if an alligator learned how to use a computer or phone or anything of that variety of device. Anyway, toodles.